So let's begin. So we're in chapter 41 of Bereshit. This is the story of Yosef. Yosef's story began earlier, but this is a story of Paro's dreams, and he summons his magicians, his wise men, to try to interpret his dreams, and they can't do so. And then the butler, who had been restored to his post, speaks up. And he says, "Eschata ani mazkira yom." I remember my bad behavior. I mentioned it now. It's an apology. That sort of explains why he didn't speak up 2 years or whatever time it was earlier. It's not clear, by the way, when the story takes place. It says after 2 years, but it doesn't say 2 years after what. And we have other places in the Bible where it says after a certain amount of time, and it's very unclear after what. So we don't know. But let's even assume it's 2 years after the incident with the dreams and the butler being restored to his post. Silent for 2 years, and now he speaks up. He recalls his sin, and he talks about someone who was with us in the jail, in the Mishmar of the Sarat HaBachim, who could interpret dreams, interpreted my dream, interpreted the dreams of the baker who was with me. So Paro rushes him out of jail. That's in verse number 14, Pasuk Yudalit, Vayiritzu min habar. And as I mentioned the last time, the use of things speed up as the story goes on. He languishes in jail, and suddenly things are speeding up. So the Paro then tells Yosef his dream or dreams, and there were two parts to the dream. The first is about the cows, the healthy cows and the unhealthy cows, and the unhealthy ones swallowing up the healthy ones. That's the first dream. The second one is the sheaves. That one, again, healthy sheaves, good sheaves, and followed by the others, and they swallow up once again the healthy sheaves. Paro wakes up, he's very disturbed, and so he tells Yosef his dream. Now, when he tells Yosef the dream, he actually, it's not identical. There's some additional elements to the dream that he tells, which are interesting. Fundamentally, it's the same dream or dreams. And Yosef is hearing what Paro tells him, which includes both what happened and to some extent Paro's take on it. And Yosef's interpretation of the dreams begin in verse number 25. I want to start with that now and move very quickly through the chapter. But before I do that, I want to make a general observation about the Yosef narrative. The Yosef narrative is an extended narrative. It's from here till the end of it. Began earlier in chapter 37 when he's sold into slavery. Then it picks up again in chapter 39. And fundamentally, the character of Yosef, the story of Yosef, is the primary story from here till the very end of Sefer Bereshit. So it's a lengthy story. It's the conclusion of the book, which is very important. Those who are thinking about the book of Genesis in general have to take that into account. That's not just a lengthy story, but it's a culminating story of the book. But I want to make a different observation, which may be obvious to everybody. I'll say it anyway. When you read the story of Yosef, it feels completely different than anything else in this book. It has a different feel to it. It's like written differently. It's much more complicated. It's very complex. And for example, what you have in the Yosef story that we don't have elsewhere is a kind of psychological insight into Joseph's character. Is somebody who cries on several occasions. You get a sense of the inner person in a very explicit way that you don't get in the rest of the book. As if this was a separate composition which is included in the book of Genesis. You know, they talk about the various documents and all that business, and I'm not going to get into that. I think it's true that there are different forms of writing within the Torah, but the idea that you can identify this particularly is D and this particularly is E and J, to me is nonsense. But this does feel different. And it's interesting. And this is the conclusion of this book. It's a different story. So that's a general observation about the Yosef narrative. In any event, Yosef's interpretation of Paro's dreams begin in verse 25. And the first thing Yosef says is, Vayomer Yosef el Paro, Halom Paro echadu. Et asher Elohim oseh higid leParo. So he makes two very important points in this verse. First of all, that the two dreams are one. We've spoken about that because the magicians thought they were two dreams. As it said in verse number 8, the ein poter otam leFaro. None could interpret them. They presume it's two dreams, and for Yosef, it's one dream. Halom Paro echadu. That's the first point. And the second point, which is critical, is that what Yosef's saying to Paro is, God is telling you, God is speaking to you. Not just dreams, your consciousness. God is telling you something. And this point that Yosef will emphasize is, God is telling you something because God is giving you the opportunity to act upon the knowledge that you are now given. I'm going to give you the knowledge, and then you have to act upon it. And the second point, related point to that, which is critical to the story, is Yosef says to Paro, this is a bit later on, why, in fact, if it's one dream, did it appear in two different forms? The parot on one hand and the shiborim on the other. So Yosef says to Paro, in verse number 32, V'yal hishanot hachalom el Paro pamayim. The fact that the God repeated hishanot from the word sheni, the dream was repeated twice. In other words, the two different dreams. It's one dream. Chalom Paro echadu. So why repeat it if it's one? Just say one. So Joseph says, Ki nachon hadavar miyetu Elohim umimaher Elohim lasoto. Because the matter is happening right away and God is hurrying to do it. Once again, the word maher. As I mentioned earlier, things are happening and suddenly everything is quickened. Everything is in a quicker pace. So Joseph says, God is speaking to you now and trying to get this message through because it requires immediate action, which will lead Joseph into the next verse. In verse number 33, V'yata, so now, V'yata, in verse 33, Yere Paro ish navon v'chacham, Paro should choose, Yere, should choose, here they translate, should find, Yere, see, but it here means to choose. The word to see sometimes means to choose. Hashem Yireh, Hashem Yamir Hayom Bahar Hashem, the mountain that God chooses, sees or chooses. So, therefore, you should appoint an Ish Navon B'chacham, a very wise, discerning person, B'shiteu al Eretz Mitzrayim, and place him over the land of Egypt. You should appoint somebody. Now, the point here is that Joseph said to Paro, the reason the dream is mentioned twice in the words of the Torah, Ki nachon hadavar. It is the word, it is nachon. It's happening right away. And therefore, and then Joseph says, and therefore, because it's nachon, Paro should appoint an ish navon, a wise person, and do so immediately. We have no time to waste. It's happening right away. So clearly, Paro will respond to Joseph and say to him, well, if God has told you all of these things, if you are God's agent, and we need somebody right away, there's no need for a job search over here, because obviously, who is wiser than you, since you're the one who figured the whole thing out? So my point is that Joseph telling Paro to appoint somebody is not Joseph giving Paro a piece of advice. It would be quite presumptuous for this slave who was jailed to give the king of Egypt advice. He's only asked for an interpretation. But the point is, the appointing of somebody right away is for Joseph part of the interpretation. That's the point over here. It's very clever. He's not saying, I give you a piece of advice. He's saying, this is what the dream is saying. And the dream is saying, by the way the dream has been structured, one dream repeated twice, it's an urgent message. So that's a very important point. Now we're making a couple of other points about the dreams of Paro, which are part of Joseph's interpretation. So Joseph says to Paro, it's all one dream. Sheva parot hatovot, sheva shanim heina, v'sheva hashiborim hatovot, sheva shanim heina, chalom echadu. So the seven, Joseph calls them parot tovot and shiborim tovot. The good shiborim, the good parot, the good shiborim, those are 7 years. So the 7 is Joseph's interpretation rests upon his understanding of the way it works from a chronological perspective. That is, the 7 are 7 years. Let's start with that. That's very important. Joseph's interpretation is an understanding of the timing of it. So the timing is, first of all, 7 years followed by 7 years. Because the Sheva HaParot HaRekot HaRaot HaOleach Rehen Sheva Shanin Heina Sheva Shiborim HaRakot Shtufot HaKadim Yu Sheva Shnei Ra'av. So in verse 27, he makes it clear. The 7 are 7 years. There are 7 good years. He calls them good years. And they are going, he spells it out explicitly in verse number 29. Hine Sheva Shanim Ba'ot. There are 7 years coming right now. Starts right now. He says, Sava Gadol B'chol Eretz Mitzrayim. There will be great abundance in the land of Egypt. Now, the word Sava, we're familiar with that word. V'achalta v'savata u'beirachta. You will eat and be satiated and bless God. That's the commandment of Birkat Hamazon. But notice that the word Sava in the Torah, there are no vowels. So Sava is Sin Bet Ayin, which is identical the way we have it to Shin Bet Ayin. So there's a play on the word Sava and the word Sheva. So the Sheva, says Joseph, also refers to Sava. But the Sava is limited to the first set of 7 years, which is 7 good years. And the second point is that Joseph says, Joseph's interpretation in verse number 30, V'kamu sheva shnei ra'av achrehen, v'nishkach kol hasava b'yeretz Mitzrayim, v'chira hara'av et ha'aretz. And here the point is, and this is the point that the Ramban makes, that in Pharaoh's dream, he sees the cows coming out of the Yaor, out of the Nile, and then they're good cows, healthy cows, whatever, briot, mulayot, whatever it is. And then afterwards, he sees 7 more cows coming out that are very frail and gaunt or whatever. And in the dream, it says, Vatamona etzel haparot al svat hayar, and they stand next to the other cows. So the understanding, Ramban emphasizes, this is certainly the case, that there's not a gap between the 7 years and the 7 years. There are 7 years of plenty, which are followed immediately by the 7 years of famine. There's no break in between them. So the 7 years of famine, and Pharaoh had remarked regarding the cows that he's never seen such sickly cows ever in the land of Egypt. So the description, at least when Pharaoh speaks about it, it sounds like there's great plenty for the first 7 years, but there's quite horrific famine for the immediately following the 7. There's another 7 years of great famine. It's one after the other with no break in between. And this will be part of Joseph's interpretation. If God is telling you all this, then what God is giving you the information to be acted upon. And that's Joseph's point. It's happening immediately. Mimaher Elohim lasoto, and there's no break in between the two. So right now, you have to prepare right now, immediately, for the years of famine, because the years of famine will follow immediately upon the years of plenty. That's part of the interpretation. And therefore, Joseph gives Pharaoh advice, which he claims is the interpretation of the dreams. So you have to act right now, vi'ata, right now, in verse number 33, Yere Paro should choose an Ish Navon B'Chacham, V'Yishiteo Eretz Mitzrayim. And then Joseph says what the dream is suggesting that you do. So let's take a look at what the dream suggests you should do. Yaseh Paro, V'Yafkei Pikidim Ala Aretz, V'Chimesh Et Eretz Mitzrayim, B'Sheva Shnei Hasava. So that's a very interesting verse. Pharaoh says Joseph should act, take steps, and appoint officers over the land, to appoint Pikidim, to appoint them over the land. Now, when you see the word Pikidim, the Yafkei Pikidim, we are reminded of the fact that Joseph himself was appointed when he first came to the land of Egypt as a Hebrew slave, back in chapter 39. He comes to the house of Potiphar. He's just a Hebrew slave there, but God is with him and he's very successful. So Potiphar appoints Joseph, and that's found in chapter 39, verse number 4. Vayafkideu al beito, v'cho yesh lo notan biyado. Vayafkideu. Joseph was appointed over his house. All that he had, he put into his hand. Next verse. Vayhi meyos hifkido to b'beito. And from the time that he was placed over the house, God blessed the house of the Egyptian, and the blessing extended to the house and the fields. So then he abandons everything into Joseph's hands. Later, that's in terms of Potiphar. Then Joseph gets in trouble in Mrs. Potiphar. He ends up in the jail, in the Beit HaSoar. And there, in the Beit HaSoar, in chapter 40, verse number 4, when these important dignitaries come to the jail, Vayifkod Sarat Tabachim et Yosef itam vayisharet otam. Joseph once again is appointed, Vayifkod. So Joseph knows what it means to be appointed, someone to carry out the will of his master, whether it's Potiphar in chapter 39 or whether it's Potiphar in chapter 40. So Joseph is speaking in a way from his own experience. The way you got to do it, he says to Pharaoh, you can't do it yourself. You got to find, in this case, many people to carry out your plan. And then he concludes with the last half of verse 34. So there's something very interesting I saw about the last half of verse 34, which reads, V'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim b'sheva shnei hasava. Now the question is, what does the word v'chimesh mean? Verse number 34, chapter 41, verse number 34. Does everybody see that? Chapter 41, verse 34. Yes, there it is. Now, what does v'chimesh mean? So here, on the bottom, this is a JPS. They typically, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. That's one of the phrases when you have a JPS Bible that you very, very often encounter. Meaning of Hebrew uncertain. But the JPS has two suggestions. One, they say, is to organize the land of Egypt. I don't know where organize is coming from. I don't understand that. I would have said, if anything, strengthen. Chamushim olu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Chamushim, either translated as they come with chamushim. They come with enough to travel, whether it's weapons, whether it's supplies, or whatever it is. But it's something that actually strengthens you, either strengthens you physically or protects you, etc. So the organized, I don't know where they're coming from. I'm sure they have some reason for that. That's one translation. Fine. I would have said strengthen. Strengthen the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. But on the bottom, they have another note. Others take a fifth part, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. That's the Rashbam. What the Rashbam says, and it's very interesting, the Chimesh et Eretz Mitzrayim, I would say, personally, is an allusion to that Pharaoh should appoint officers over the land during the years of plenty, and take a fifth part. In other words, take something off the top, which you're going to store under your control, and that fifth part will be supplies that you will dole out during the 7 years of famine that immediately follow. That's one way to read it. It's not clear to me that Pharaoh takes a fifth part. It sounds to me more like, as we'll read more, he may take a lot more than a fifth part. But the Rashbam had a different point in mind, actually, which I thought was very interesting. And that is that, if you remember later on in the Joseph story, in chapter 47, so after 1 year, so Pharaoh has collected all of the food during the years of, or a good deal of food during the years of plenty, and he puts Joseph in control of the food. Joseph will dole out the food to the people who come for food, the Egyptians, and even people who come from other places. And he will sell them food. It's for sale. Chapter 47. So the story in chapter 47 is when they come for food in chapter 47, after 1 year of the years of famine, the people come to Joseph and say, we have no money. There's no money left. We're broke. We have no money. What are we going to do? And Joseph says to them, okay, if you have no money, Pharaoh will take your cattle and your animals instead of money. So that's what happens. They give their cattle, their various animals to Pharaoh. In return for that, he gives them food. Then the Torah continues in chapter 47, but the following year they go back to Joseph and they say to Joseph, we have no money and we have no food. No money and no food. So you got to read a little bit more. That's it. That's the cattle. Next verse. Keep going down more. Right. Back up a second. That's it. Back up one verse. Right. They say that's it. Back up. No, you had it before. Where is this? Let me tell you which verse it is. Hold on a second. Verse number 18. Verse 18. 18. Right there. Vati Toma Shanahi. Is that verse 18 there?
No.
Next one down. That's it. Vati Toma Shanahi. That year, second year ended. They came in the second year, at the end of the second year, and they said, listen, we can't hide from you. We have no money. Tama kesef. Umikneha b'mar Adoni. Onishal ufnei Adoni. Piltiyim gviotenu v'admatenu. All we have left is our bodies and our land. Keep going down. We have no money. We have no cattle. Why should we die before you? We'll die and our land will die. Purchase us for the bread. We'll give you the land and ourselves for lechem. And we and our land shall be slaves unto Pharaoh. Give us seed. We'll live and not die, and the land will not become a waste. And Joseph does that. Vayiken Yosef et Kol Admat Mitzrayim, the Pharaoh, etc. So Joseph does that. So now the Pharaoh owns all the people of Pharaoh's slaves, as it were, and he owns all of the land. But now the Torah continues and says that Joseph, however, did not simply take all the land for Pharaoh. If you read down some more, you will see that, let's find the verse. Verse number 23 and verse 24. 23 and 24, that's it. So Joseph did not purchase, all the land was purchased for Pharaoh except the land of the Kohanim. And then Joseph says, I have purchased you and your land for Pharaoh. Heilochem Zera, that's 23, and see the land. Read down more, one more verse, down more, one verse, that's it. When you harvest the land, give 1/5 to Pharaoh. Pharaoh takes 1/5, a chamishit. But 80%, 4/5 will be for you, etc. So Joseph says, okay, on the books, you're all slaves to Pharaoh, the land is Pharaoh's, but he's not going to take your land from you. He's just going to take 20%. He's going to take 20%. So the Rashbam, actually, what the Rashbam is saying, going back to our story, when Joseph says to Pharaoh, you should appoint officers over the land, let's say strengthen, or they say organize, strengthen the land of Egypt. The Rashbam says this is an allusion to the fact that Pharaoh is going to take a fifth. And I find this very interesting because it supports the basic thesis that I've been pushing, and I pushed in the past, that the reason that Pharaoh loves Joseph's advice is simply because what Joseph is doing is two things. First of all, he's figuring out a way to save the land of Egypt from mass starvation. That's the first point. Because without this, the years of plenty will be long forgotten and people will all starve. It's a terrible famine, unusual for the land of Egypt. But in addition to this, he's doing something else. He's telling Pharaoh to appoint officers over the land and to strengthen the land. But then if you continue reading, what he says is, in verse number 35, gather all the food, it says all the food, of the good years, here we come to a very critical verse. And they should gather the grain, all should be collected, and here are the three words, tachat yad paro, under Pharaoh's hand, under Pharaoh's control. Remember, we had encountered the word yad earlier in the Joseph story. One who has the upper hand. Initially, everything's put into Joseph's hand. Then Joseph loses his power when he finds his coat in her hand, in the hands of Mrs. Potiphar. Then when he gets to jail, everything once again is placed beyond Paro. Then the beyond Yosef. Then Joseph interprets the dream of the baker and the butler has a good dream because he places the cup on Pharaoh's palm. He puts it into Pharaoh's hand. So he's going to do well. But the other guy, the baker, the birds eat the flour off his head. So nothing goes to Pharaoh. Obviously, his head will be removed because he does nothing for Pharaoh. That's the lesson that Joseph learns. And over here, the point is tachat yad paro. If Pharaoh controls all of the food, right? Ochel be'arim and put it into central locations, into the cities, v'shamaru, and it means shamaru means watch it or guard it. A shomer is a guard. You will have all the food. And then he continues, v'ayochel pikadon. The food shall be a reserve, but the word pikadon, again, to play on the word pikadon. Could be a guarantee, could be reserved. But remember that Joseph told Pharaoh, Yafked Pekidim, to appoint officers who will do your bidding. The food will be a pikadon, means a reserve, yes, but it means like an officer, like one who works for Pharaoh. It will all be yours. And what Joseph understands, because he always understood it, even as a little kid, that the one who controls the food, others will be forced to bow down. That was Joseph's dream as a 17-year-old. He told his brothers, we're all in the field, sheaving sheaves. Your sheaves bow down to my sheaf. Joseph understands, if you control the food, if you have a monopoly on the food, and people need food, you will have ultimate power. And you're going to take this food during the years of plenty when people won't miss it. Either you're going to ration it out during the 7 years, or you let them have even more. You take it off the top, whether it's 20% or 70%. Joseph speaks about taking all of the food under your control, maybe even doling it out during the years of plenty. And then when the years of famine come, nobody has food except you. So if nobody has food except you, it's obvious. You can charge whatever you want. There's no competition, monopoly. After 1 year, no money. Why no money after 1 year? Because he's charging a high price. If you charge less, okay, then there will be money. So you have then you're going to get their money, Then you're going to get their cattle. Then you're going to get their land, which in fact are Pharaoh's dreams. Because the first dream of Pharaoh is about the cattle, the parot. And the second dream is about the land. Anyway, I want to make one important point over here about the Chumash, what the Chumash is saying, and I'll stop and take questions. When Joseph says, when this chapter says that Pharaoh's dreams are all one, that is, of course, true. And Joseph interprets it. It's one dream repeated because God is trying to get the urgent message through, namely, act today, don't wait. Crisis. Yes, it's in 7 years, but it starts now. You've got to prepare now for the 7 years. That is all true. It's one dream. But, and here's the point of chapter 47, it's also two dreams, because there are two separate dreams. One is a dream about the cows, about the cattle, and the other is a dream about the land. And in point of fact, why does Pharaoh have a bad dream altogether? He has a bad dream because in the previous narrative, he had to execute his baker, the person in charge of the lechem. So the lechem is not in his control. The man in charge of lechem is not putting anything into Pharaoh's hands. So off with his head. But still, you don't have the lechem. And now Joseph has given Pharaoh an opportunity to control the lechem, which is what the king wants, to control the lechem. You control the lechem, everybody's got to bow down to you. They'll be grateful you enslave them. That's what happens later on. So is it one dream or two? Depends which chapter you're reading. In our chapter, it's all one dream, and Joseph explains. Act right away, appoint someone immediately, take all the food under your control, guard it, no one can get it. And that's Joseph's dream, his own dreams. He understands Pharaoh's dream perfectly. He has the same dreams. How do you control? How do you become the most powerful person? So that's one dream in this chapter, two dreams in the next chapter. Now let me stop at this point before we continue with this thought about the dreams and take comments or questions.
Can I say something, Rabbi Silber?
Yes, certainly.
Judging from modern Hebrew, and maybe you will double check, I think it's not pronounced Sava, but Sova, because it's kamatz katan, like Tso Horaim. Like the tzad is with the kamatz, but we say Tso because kamatz katan is like cholam. So in Hebrew, the opposite of Ra'av is Sova. So maybe it deserves another checking.
Well, the text we have, I mean, all the texts have it Sava, but you're right. In modern Hebrew,
no, but it might be kamatz katan, and then you say Sova, but that I say is as a speaker of the language.
Okay, I can accept that, but the fact of the matter is that whether it's Sova or Sava, it is, it's written without the vav, and it certainly plays off on the word Sheva, which is, you know, it's I'll come back to that. It's the years of plenty, and the point of Joseph's dream is that the only way to save the people during the years where there's no food at all is to take from the good, as it were, was the parot are called tovot, parot tovot, shibolim tovim, and to use that food, because during the latter 7 years there was no food. So the only way to do it is that the 7 years, to use the years of the food of the 7 years, but to distribute it over 14 years. That's part of the plan over here. That was to take something that you have, but to figure out the best way to use it. Yes. That's what Joseph's interpretation entails. And I would add to this the following observation, which is that Pharaoh, after Joseph gives his interpretation, so Pharaoh turns to his servants, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but in verse 38, Hanimtza kozeh ish asher ruach Elohim bo. Pharaoh turns to his servants. He says to them, let me ask you something. Can we find anybody? Hanimtza kozeh ish asher ruach Elohim. This is a person who has the Spirit of God in him. It sounds like Pharaoh actually is trying to convince his servants, because after all, who is Joseph? Forget the fact that he's coming out of jail, but he's a foreigner. He's an Eved Ivri. So we know that Mrs. Potiphar spoke to the house and said to her household, look what my husband did. He brought the foreigner to be our Lord. Pharaoh's about to do the same thing. So he's got to figure out a way to sell Joseph to his people. Yes, he is the Pharaoh, but even the Pharaoh doesn't want disgruntled servants. So he turns to him and says, listen, this is a person who has Ruach Elohim bo. I'll come back to this point because he's trying to sell Joseph to them in a different way. The Pope doesn't have to be Italian. That's his point, right? The holy man can be from any place. Yes, he's a Hebrew, that's true. But he's a holy man. And he's going to try to sell Joseph in that. One of the ways he's going to try to sell Joseph is he's a Ruach Elohim. God speaks to him, clearly. God speaks to him and God gives him wisdom, which is beneficial to us. That's number one. But the expression Ruach Elohim, actually, is one that is familiar to us as students of the Bible, because that's how the Torah begins. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. V'yarta tohu vavo, and the earth was tohu and vohu. Let's call it chaos. Choshech al panei tahom, with darkness over the face of the abyss. V'ruach Elohim merachepet al panei hamayim. And the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. You can't read the story over here of Joseph when Pharaoh says this is a person who has Ruach Elohim without stopping to consider what Ruach Elohim suggests. And I think it suggests several things. And I will mention three, but I'll mention one right now. That Ruach Elohim, if we presume, and it's a great mystery, if we presume that what the Torah is saying in the beginning of the Torah, that the earth was tohu and vohu. What in the world is tohu and vohu? So one way to understand tohu and vohu is unformed matter. There's mass, there's matter without form. V'ruach Elohim merachepet al panei hamayim, and the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. Ruach Elohim, the Targum says, one of the Targum says, Chochmat Elohim, the wisdom of God. And the particular wisdom of God in the beginning of the Torah is the ability to take something and to use it in the most efficacious way. For example, somebody else in the Torah who has Ruach Elohim is none other than Betzalel. So Betzalel has Ruach Elohim. He's the architect of the Mishkan. God says, "V'amalei to Ruach Elohim b'chachma b'tfuna u'v'dat u'v'chol melacha." There it's explicit. It means wisdom. I have filled him with the Spirit of God. He has chachma, he has tvuna, and he has dat. Chachma, bina, and dat. Chabad, right? Which is the first blessing of the Amidah, the first request of the Amidah in the Sephardic Shmona Esrei. Chachma, bina, v'dat. So what is the wisdom of Betzalel? The wisdom of Betzalel, presumably, is to take the materials that people donate to the temple and to use them to fashion the most beautiful Mishkan. That's his wisdom. So that's one way to read the beginning of the Chumash too. The wisdom of God is the ability to take the tohu and vohu, the unformed matter, and take this matter and to fashion it in a very beautiful way. Best of all possible worlds, beautiful world. If we think of it in those terms, then Ruach Elohim over here makes perfect sense. Because what is Joseph's genius over here? Joseph's genius is exactly that. You have 7 years of plenty. There's a lot of produce during these 7 years. Now the question is, what is the most efficient way to use this produce? And what Joseph says is, what you got to be careful over here is not to eat up all the produce during the first 7 years. Because in the 7 years that follow immediately, there's nothing. And you all die. So the wisdom then is to take the produce and take this produce and use it in the most efficacious way. Well, the most efficacious way is to dole it out. So that's the Ruach Elohim. Of course, he makes a separate point. The one doing the doling, the one who's controlling all of it, is of course Paro. So therefore, he can dole it out, of course. But he can also demand that the people who want food, and the alternative is to starve, that the people who want food will pay any price that Pharaoh feels is appropriate. And of course, the one who will be in charge of all this is, of course, Joseph. So this is the Ruach Elohim. It's one way to understand Ruach Elohim over here. The wisdom of God. Okay, anybody else have any other comments here before we continue? Comments or questions?
I just wanted to say that the different feeling that Sipur Yosef has, I think has to do with a different genre, because about Avraham and Yitzchak, we have a sort of collection of short stories. It's a collection of short stories. They don't really build up a novel or a romance and Sipur Yosef is half of Sefer Bereshit, and it has a feeling of what we would call today a novel, or I don't know.
That I completely agree with. Of course, one could argue that I agree. It reads like a novella. The Joseph story reads like a novella.
Reading like a novella.
That's actually what's very interesting. Not the documentary nonsense, but this is much more interesting, actually. It's a completely different sense. Now, of course, one could make the argument that if the Torah is capable of having a novella in the Joseph narrative, then the Torah is equally capable of fashioning a novella in the Abraham narrative, if the Torah wished to do so. So it begs the question, why actually is it? I don't have an answer, but why is it that in the Joseph story, it's exactly what you said? I think it's a very excellent point.
I think I have
a novel. It's like a novel.
I think I have an answer.
That's
because
it.
if you look at this novella, it's parallel in a way to Esther novella, to Daniel novella, and all of these novellas, but they have in common, they take part in the diaspora, in the big civilizations, and not in the agrarian, poor Canaan, agrarian society, which is not developed enough to build up a novella. Think about
that would depend on how one sees, I suppose. It's certainly the case, without question, that the Esther story and the Daniel story are playing off the Joseph story. That's clear. And the Esther story plays off the Joseph story. I mean, we've learned it in the past. I counted once 50 different allusions to Esther, to the Joseph story in the book of Esther, 50 allusions to it. Whether it's 50 or whether it's 73 or whether it's 41, it makes no difference, obviously. And yes, it is about exile. There's no question about that. But whether that is sufficient enough to explain the difference, that's a very interesting question. So I'll have to leave that for now. But I'm simply pointing out that it is the case. And you have things like Joseph's psychological state, which the Chumash, Orbach's mimesis writes about the fact that the Torah doesn't give us very much insight into what people are thinking, which is largely true. But it's not true in the case of Joseph. Yes, it is true that you don't know exactly what motivates him, but the Torah does present Joseph as a conflicted person. He has his brothers on one hand, he has his present life in Egypt on the other, etc. So my point is, if you just step back from it, it's exactly as Sava says. It feels like a novella. It's a completely different feel to it, which is very interesting to think about. Let's just think about that. Anybody else have any comments or questions here?
Yeah.
Yes.
You had mentioned that the Ramban said that Omeid al Hayor, that it's or, and it occurred to me that what was Paro's trepidation and what caused him so much distress at this, it was the recognition that in the end, the Nile is like a be'er. In other words, that although Egypt is defined by the Nile, which is nature is always there and always gives, but in the end, it really is a be'er. And we know that actually the Nile nowadays is drying up also, but leave that aside. It was in his dream, it was a recognition that he was going to lose the source of his power, and your description then of Yosef giving him back that sense of power, that Israel is the Be'er culture where you have to depend on God, whereas Egypt is the Nile culture where you don't have to depend on God. Well, Paro in his dream recognized even with the Nile he's got to depend on God.
That's a very interesting observation. I think that I think it's true. I think that, I mean, as I suggested, for other reasons, that when kings have bad dreams, whether it's Ahasuerus who can't sleep, or whether Paro has bad dreams, it's often on Nebuchadnezzar. It's about their own status, and most kings in the Bible are mostly concerned about themselves. They're not having sleepless nights that the people don't get enough food, They have sleepless nights that maybe they're going to lose their power. So it's an interesting point. By the way, we'll come back to this idea of the or being related to the word or, which the Ramban suggests. Actually, I'm going to be speaking on the east side of Manhattan, a scholar in residence, on the Shabbos just before Hanukkah, and they have me down in one of the lectures about Hanukkah and light, and I'm going to talk about Joseph and light. But here's something interesting to think about. I don't want to get into this now, but the word for river, one word is Ya'ar, but another word for river in the Bible is the word Nahar.
Nahar.
Nun He Resh. Now the word Nahara appears in Nahara and in Aramaic, in Book of Eov. Nehirin, right? Means light, basically.
Right.
So you have it pretty explicitly that Nahar is related to light. So the Ramban's point about Ya'ar being related to light and rain being related to light, I think is certainly supported by the word Nahar, which clearly is related to the word light, wherever it's coming from initially, whether it's Arabic or Aramaic or whatever. There's no question about it that the word, and you have it attested to in the Bible as well, in Eov, Nahara means light. So it is interesting to note, and we'll get back to this point about light, because the light of, let me make one observation to whet your interest in this, and that is when in the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Brit Ben Abitarim in chapter 15, which is central covenant of the Torah, covenant of the land, it says that when God speaks to Abraham, a deep dread fell over him. And the Torah says that during this interaction with God, when Abraham is being informed about the suffering, the Geirut, the Avdut, the Inui, and he's a dark and deep dread, the sun was setting, right? Let me find this other verse. Right, and later on in verse number 17 of chapter 15, Hashemesh ba'a, sunset, ba'alata haya, and there was great darkness, alata, deep darkness. And of course, we know that the covenant that God makes with Abraham has more than one fulfillment, but one of, if not the primary fulfillment of the Geirut, Avdut and Inui, is the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's exactly the story of one can't even understand the story of the Exodus unless one understands the fulfillment of the covenant of chapter 15. The Passover Haggadah is completely based on that thought. And it's obvious when you read the Chumash. If you know how to read the Chumash, it's clear. So the Torah identifies this place of the suffering as a place of darkness. And it's not a coincidence that the next to last plague, the 9th plague before they leave, is the plague of darkness. So there's something very interesting here about light and darkness, that Pharaoh stands by the side of the Ya'ar, the place of light. And what Joseph is telling Pharaoh basically is how to let the light shine, even during times of darkness, even during the 7 years of famine, when there's no food, when the Ya'ar produces nothing. But there's a way to have the light shine even in the darkest places. That's the story of Joseph here in chapter 41. But later, in the book of Exodus, which begins with the verse, and a new Pharaoh arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Somehow they forget all about Joseph, with the blessings that Joseph brought, and especially to Pharaoh. Then we move from the light to the darkness. And that's a theme that runs all the way through the book of Exodus. The last verse of Exodus talks about the Mishkan, the traveling, that at night there was the great fire, is the great light. So the theme of darkness and light is a pervasive theme in the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. And that's how the book of Exodus ends, actually, with the Mishkan, with this sacred space in which there's light, even in the darkest moments, even at night. But there's the Eish Tia Labo, before Israel and all of their journeys. There's always a light that travels with them. Over here, We'll come back to this Yaor business about the light, but it's very interesting. And actually, when you're thinking about this, I saw all kinds of things that are obvious when you see them, but not before you see them. So, how these themes are pervasive, how they carry through. That's what interests us over here, among other things. Okay, anybody else? Thank you for that, Chaim. Anybody else for a comment? And we'll stop. Yes.
I just want to highlight a comment from the chat.
Go ahead.
Neva Goldstein Hellman pointed out that Nile may be related to Nachar. In historical linguistics, L and R are often interchanged as they are very close phonetically.
Okay, it could be. I have no idea. I'm completely ignorant when it comes to this, but it could be so. It's certainly true in the Chumash. It's certainly true that the word Nahar is related to Nahora, which is the Aramaic Nahora is light, right? So there's no question about that. I believe in Arabic they're related as well. Pretty sure about that. Okay, so let's now continue with our. Let's continue. So we're in chapter 41. So Joseph has given Pharaoh this suggestion, or I might say interpretation, right? That the food will be a pikadon and fine. And now we have Pharaoh's response in verse number 37, which is very interesting. Joseph has given Pharaoh the key to power, the key to solving his problem, that the lechem is not under his control. He can control all the lechem, and you control all the lechem, you control everything. So this matter was pleasing, was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants. If Pharaoh turns to his servants, he says, can anybody find a person like this? A person in whom dwells, in whom is the Spirit of God. This is a nice verse for a different reason. I just want to mention it now, and we'll pick it up at a later time. It's a typical example. I said the language here is, the Hebrew is so terse, it's so complex. Every word has to be looked at. And in this verse, which Pharaoh is, I think, trying to reinforce the fact that Joseph is really the right guy, because he has Ruach Elohim, because he's not an Egyptian. He doesn't have to be. He's a holy man. But there's something else over here. Can one find such a person? And we have found a treasure. And we, the reader, read this verse and we remind ourselves of something. That this word hanimtza, can one find? And we are remembering that beginning in chapter 38, story of Judah and Tamar, when Judah sent his servant Chira, his friend, to find Tamar, to retrieve his staff and his coat and his seal. And he says, I can't find her. She's disappeared. I can't, Lomit Satya. And Judah says, well, look, what can we do? You didn't find her. I tell Lomit Sa'ah. And then she's being taken out. He mutsait, which plays off that. And that chapter 38, which interrupts the Joseph story. What am I saying? It's a prelude to everything that follows in the book of Genesis. And we remember that in the story of Joseph, Reuben went back to the pit and said, Hayelad Einenu, the boy is missing. Einenu, he's not dead necessarily, he's missing. He is not. Einenu. And if someone is missing, what do? You look for him, don't you? You search for him. In the story of Judah and Tamar, Judah did make an attempt to find Tamar. It was a half-hearted attempt because he's not going to start asking everybody around, have you seen that prostitute? As Judah himself says, that's embarrassing. We can't do that. Of course, if you don't ask that question, you don't get back your staff and your seal and your coat, the symbols of your leadership. Okay, but it's not worth it to him. So therefore, don't do it. And then she confronts him. She sends them back to him. He says, do you recognize these things? But the point of the Joseph story is that we expect, because Hayelad Einenu, the boy is missing, and several times throughout the book of Genesis, it refers to Joseph as missing. If he's missing, you search. But the brothers make no attempt to search, or more likely to find him. And the word to find is going to be one of those words that will appear at critical moments from this point on in the book. Well, Pharaoh found him. Look what we found, he says. Can any person, can anybody else be found? Look at the treasure here. And in Tzakazeh. And the contrast of the brothers who make zero attempt to find Joseph, who in fact try to convince their father that Joseph is dead and make no attempt to find him. And that's one of the problems until they are going to be put in a situation where they do find him, but don't realize they found him. And that will be very central to the story. But we have to keep our ears open and eyes open for the word nimtza or matzah. It's going to appear in several places. It already appeared earlier. The Torah sets it up. The Judah Tamaz story sets up this idea of searching and finding or not finding. Okay, let us now continue. Fine. So that's what Pharaoh says to his servants. And now Pharaoh speaks to Joseph, beginning in verse number 39. And it's very striking. Vayoma Paro Yosef. He says, look, he says, if God speaks through you, no one is more navon and chacham than you. Obviously, find a wise person, you're the wisest person. Ata tial beiti, v'alpicha yishakol ami, rak hakisei egdal mimeka. You'll be in charge of my bayit, of my house. Reminds us of Potiphar. He placed him al beito, al bayit v'al sadeh. It's a repeat of the Potiphar story. And by the way, it gets you to think, I think, that the whole experience in the house of Potiphar and the rise to power in the house of Potiphar, and he's not just a butcher, he's a high official of Pharaoh's court. He has a jail in his house. He jails the important people in Pharaoh's court, the Sarah Mashlim, the Sarah Ophir. And all of this was a good experience for Joseph. So Joseph is learning from Potiphar's house. He learns from Potiphar's jail. This is all preparation for assuming power. And Pharaoh says the same thing. You're going to be in charge of everything, right? You're in charge of my bayit. Just remember, only the throne is greater. Remember, you're second in command, not the first. Don't ever think about being the first. There's no response. Joseph says nothing. And verse number 41, he continues to speak. Vayoma Paro Yosef. Look here, he says, I have appointed you over the land of Egypt. Vayaser Paro et tabato mayal yodo. Vayitain ota al yad Yosef. Pharaoh took the ring off his own hand and placed it on Joseph's hand. Al yad, remember the word yad we emphasize so much. The one in control. Now Joseph has the ring, Pharaoh's ring, on Joseph's hand. Vayabesh oto bigdei sheish, and he dresses him in bigdei sheish, in robes of linen. Vayasem ravid hazahav al tzavaro. He gives him a gold necklace. So once again, Joseph is getting a new set of clothing. He always gets new sets of clothing. But here it's the clothing of the king. It's the king that's wearing. He has the king's ring. And he has him ride in the chariot of the Mishneh, the second in command. He has his own chariot, his own Rolls Royce over here, with a big letter 2 on it. And they all cried out Avrech. What Avrech is a mystery. Could be bow down, could be Avrech as a kind of a dignitary. But whatever it is, it's an accolade. He's driving through with the chariot. The chariot is a symbol of Egypt. Sus v'roch vo ramav ayam, the chariot of Egypt. He's traveling in the chariot, and people are bowing down. And Pharaoh says, and he's placed over the land of Egypt. He's placed him over the land of Egypt. The Naton is an interesting construction. Paro Yosef ani Paro. Now Pharaoh says, I'm Pharaoh. Nobody moves without you. Ani Paro was a double meaning. Ani Paro, I'm Pharaoh. Don't forget, I'm Pharaoh. You're the second. Ani Pharaoh has a different meaning. I've given them the order. They're commanded by me to obey you. Don't forget that. That's an important point we'll get to later in our study. I commanded them to obey. Nobody moves without your consent. Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Tzafnat Paneach. Vayitenu et Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On Lisha. Vayetze Yosef al Eretz Mitzrayim, and now we're told something else. He called Joseph Tzafnat Paneach. He gave Joseph a different name, Tzafnat Paneach. It's a mysterious name, but what we do know from the Chumash is that one of the gods of Egypt is called Baal Tzafon. Tzafon in general was the place of the gods in ancient Near Eastern. So I have to presume that Tzafnat Paneach is a name, it's not Yosef. He gives him a different name. And remember, a name in the book of Genesis is your identity. Jacob becomes Israel, Abraham becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, and now we have Joseph, Yosef, Tzafnat Paneach. Some name of, presumably some name of some Egyptian god. And not just that, Vayitenu et Osnat bat Potifera Kohen on Isha. And he's marrying Osnat, the daughter of Potifera, the Kohen, as a wife. Now, I don't believe that Potifera and Potiphar are the same person, because Potiphar was a Sarat HaBachim, and Potifera is a priest, and not just any old priest either. He's Kohen On, Aleph Vav Nun, priest of On. Whatever that is, the word On is without question a negative word in general. Remember that Rachel had named her son Ben Oni, and Jacob changes the name. Kohen On is certainly negative. He's now the son-in-law of some very important priest in Egypt with a different name, married to Osnat. So if we think about this Joseph, looking at Joseph, we don't know what Joseph thinks, but looking at Joseph from a distance, objectively looking at Joseph. And we ask ourselves the question, is this guy a Jew or not? So let's say he lives outside the land. He is dressed by Pharaoh. He's wearing Egyptian dress. He drives around in the symbol of Egypt, the Merkevet HaMishneh. He's married to the daughter of a high priest of Egypt. Tzafnat Paneach is his name. So in every measure of what it means to be a Jew in this book, the answer is unequivocally, he's not Jewish. I mean, in any objective measure, he's not a Jew. He's a full-fledged, 100% Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian. He's named like an Egyptian. He travels like an Egyptian. He's connected to the Egyptian priesthood. And in fact, going back to that verse, can we find a person such as the Spirit of God in him, Elohim, which is the generic term for God, not the Jewish God. So he's being Pharaoh, we understand from Pharaoh's perspective, perhaps. He wants Joseph to be seen as a Kohen, as a priestly man, as a godly man, because that can remove part of the stigma of not being an Egyptian. But at the end of the day, he's the Ivri. But okay, as I said, the Pope can be Polish, the Pope could be anything. But the question is, what does Joseph think? We know the Joseph of chapter 39, that we know the story of Mrs. Potiphar. From an ethical, moral standpoint, he's not an Egyptian. In that story, he resists Mrs. Potiphar, and he says, it's wrong, I can't do it. It's we affront to God. It's a breach of trust. It shows deep ingratitude. And we know that in Mitzrayim, the first story was seeing and taking. That we do know. But what about over here? What do we know? We don't know anything yet. We know what he looks like. But what about the inner Joseph? But here, if you skip a couple of verses, and we conclude with verse number 50, how much time do I have here? Do I have a couple more minutes? What time is it, Caleb?
It is 11:08.
Good, 7 minutes, great. Let's go to verse 50 for a moment, and 51 and 52, and we'll just make a reference to those three verses and continue next week. Uli Yosef yulad shnei banim b'terem tavo shnat harav. Asher yodalo Osnat bat Potifera Kohen On. The Torah beats you over the head about Osnat. She's Osnat, the daughter of Potifera, the priest of On. There were two sons born to Joseph during the years before the years of famine. In other words, the point is, the years of famine produces, there's no production. And the Torah says that, but Joseph is 2 years children are born to Joseph during the years of plenty, it's a way of, once again, connecting Joseph to what goes on in Egypt. Egypt is producing a lot of grain. Joseph would also not produce 2 children. When the famine will come, there'll be no more children. We know of no other children that Joseph has, certainly not explicit in the Chumash. So it's another way of suggesting that Joseph's life is in sync with what's going on in the land of Egypt. That's number one. And we'll come back to this next week too. And then we have the name, and this is very important. Vayikra Yosef b'shem ha'bechor Menashe. Joseph named his oldest son Menashe. Ki nashani Elohim et kol amoli v'et kol beit avi. He named his oldest son Menashe, saying, God has made me or enabled me to forget completely my hardship and my parental home. So Menashe means forget. Inshi means forget. Minshi is to forget. Says Joseph, Baruch Hashem, I'm able to forget my suffering, and I'm able to forget my father's house, my home. I'm now in the land of Egypt. You know, it's interesting that there was a big dispute years ago in the Gush. It was a dispute between 2 of the more significant figures in the Gush. So there's Yoel ben Nun and Yaakov Meidan. It was one of the Rosh Yeshiva, 2 very interesting people. And they both discussed the question, why didn't Joseph contact his father? Joseph seems concerned about his father. He never writes a letter to his father. The Ramban asked that, why didn't he write a letter to his father? Now, I just have to say at the outset that the formulation of the question, to me, I would never ask such a question. It's a wrong-headed question, in my view. The Ramban, the great Ramban, notwithstanding, why someone doesn't do something in a text or a novel is never a question you ask. Never. Why didn't someone do something in a novel? Because that's not the novel. But okay, so don't frame it that way. But the point is this: it's not a question of what he doesn't do. It's a question of what he does say. He says it explicitly. I want to forget my suffering and my father's house. So why does he want to forget his father's house? So Meidan and Ben Nun have a dispute. Okay, one said that one claimed, that was Yoel ben Nun, that he suspected his father might have been in some sense on the sale. That I think is completely wrong altogether. I don't think he suspects that whatsoever, and there's not one shred of evidence. Yes, Yaakov does set it up inadvertently by sending Joseph. He's responsible in that sense, but his intention was never to put Joseph in jeopardy. I mean, he understands there's some danger, there's no question. So I don't think that's possible, that he actually is part of the plot. The other one, Meidan took a different approach, which is found in the Ramban and others, that Joseph is waiting for the dreams to come true. And he understands that you can't contact the past until the dreams come true. Okay, we'll get to that later on in our study. I must confess that neither of these 2, the first one I think is completely off base. Even the second one I don't particularly care for. I think it's a misunderstanding. But I'll give a very simple explanation of it. Simple, from my own experience. Simple explanation, nothing deep. We'll get to the deep stuff later, but it's very simple. Why didn't he contact his father? And the answer is very simple, because his own brothers tried to kill him. And by the way, as far as Joseph knows, they were actually going to kill him, because Joseph doesn't know who picked the brothers. If you assume the brothers didn't actually sell him, but the Midianite traders came by and pulled him out of the pit, then Joseph has no idea what the brothers were thinking. They were thinking to sell him. But if you assume they didn't sell him, which is the plain reading of the Chumash, as far as Joseph knows, they planned to kill me and somebody else pulled me out and saved me. I sent me as a slave, that's true. So one way or the other, the brothers are guilty minimally of causing him to be a slave, and he was in jail and the works. So as far as he's concerned, that's his past. That's the brothers. Why didn't he contact his father? And I think the answer is very simple. I grew up with survivors, and they never talked about it. But the important fact, I'm sure that many of them had many wonderful memories about their past. But you know what? For a lot of these people, I'm in America now. I'm starting over again. I got a new family, and the past is the past. I'm not going to start thinking about the past, about this good thing or that good thing. The past is gone. and now I'm starting in a new place. And that, I think, is the plain shot over here, what Joseph says. Says Joseph, you know something? Here I am in Egypt. Look at me. I came as a slave, 6 cents in my pocket, you know? I'm the second most powerful person in this land. What a land of opportunity for me. Yes, it comes at a cost. But the fact of the matter is, I forgot. My oldest son is named Forgetting. I'm forgetting that past. And when you forget the past, you forget it all. I can't forget a piece of it and remember a piece of it. I'm forgetting the past and my father's house, which includes my father. As much as I care about my father, and he does care about his father. But the fact of the matter is, Joseph says, look, that's my past. This is the place I am now. This is where I am now. This is about my success in this land. This is Menashe. This is my first. Yes, now he has a second child. And the second child he named Ephraim. Ifrani Elohim Be'eretz Anyi, which means God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction, and probably means when I first came here, it was the land of my affliction. And now I've managed to overcome it and to succeed in the land of my affliction. But I would say, and we'll get to this later, I hope at some point, before the year is over, before the academic year is over, that there may be a recognition that Egypt was once a land of my affliction, but I'm not so sure it's not going to be the land of my affliction in the future, or even now. Even now, I'm still the Jew in Egypt. So the second name, Ephraim, represents something about at least a recognition that Mitzrayim at least was, if not now, a place of suffering, a place of affliction. But the first name is a celebration of the present and a forgetting of the past. And when you want to forget the past, sometimes you just got to forget the whole thing. You just got to move on. And I think that's what it's about. Why didn't he send a letter to his father? I mean, the question is wrong-headed, but the point is, the answer to that question, which we would rephrase, is because that's part of his past. And he can't send to X without saying to Y. And that he doesn't want to send to Y. He doesn't want to remember his family, which tried to murder him. Let's not forget that. And as far as Joseph is concerned, would have murdered him if somebody else hadn't come along and taken him out of the pit. He doesn't know that till later on he hears there was even a discussion about it. He discovers that in chapter 42. They brothers start thinking about what happened in the past. So I think that's the point over here. But my point is, if he named his son Menashe, then we can say he's really a full-fledged Jew, but all the other things are things that happened to him. No, the name Menashe suggests that it's much deeper than that, that on some level he is assimilated into Mitzrayim. He does buy into it in some way. True, that in some ethical sense he never can buy into it. And that's for the chapter 39. Chapter 39 is, at the end of the day, something ethical about Joseph that precludes his being the full Egyptian. Having said all that, he is driving in the Egyptian chariot with the Egyptian name, Egyptian wife, and a high priest of Egypt as the father-in-law.
I wanted to ask something.
Yes.
It's in Pasuk Mem Daled,
Yes.
when it says Ani Paro,
Yes.
Vayomer Paro, and I thought he was like saying, just remember from me you derive all your power.
Right. That was like the second option. I've told them to do it, but right, exactly. Which we will see, by the way, is a very, very important point that Joseph, I believe, forgets. In other words, it's very simple to think. Not does he forget it. Later on, when he talks to the brothers, it sounds like I'm the one really in charge. And that's dangerous because saw that in Potiphar's house, you're not really in charge. You really have no power. You have the power that the person in charge grants you.
That the person
The
invests
the person
in you.
in charge doesn't need you anymore. This is part of the problem. Once they don't need you, you know, I've had my experience in my life with some people, you know, when they need you, they love you. And suddenly they don't think they don't need you anymore. And David, who's that guy? You know, that kind of thing. I'm sure we've all had that experience, you know. So the fact is, yeah, that's for sure. That's one way to read it. Right. One way to read it is I'm going to make sure that they obey you because I'm telling them to do it. One way is don't forget that I'm your boss and your formulation. Don't forget that any power you happen to have is because of me. And without me, you got nothing. That's also true. All right, we'll stop it at this point. Thank you for that. Looking forward to next week. We'll continue.
All right.
you.
Looking
Have a
forward to
great
seeing
week.
everyone next week. Thank you once again for joining us for another session of Jacob and his children, A Journey Through Genesis. And you can find out about more classes at Drisha on our website at drisha.org/classes. Thank you, everyone.